Unmute there. Sorry. Hi, I'm Meg Wilcox. I teach at Mount Royal University. I teach in the journalism department and I teach podcasting. I developed the first podcasting class for the university and it's been running for about 4 years now. I'm right now in the process of building a podcasting hub at the university where we're working to connect the community with our students who are learning to produce podcasts and tell those stories as well. But for me, I got into podcasting as a radio producer. So before I was teaching, I was a journalist. I worked across the country with the CBC and a bunch of other places. And I got into podcasting specifically while I was working at the Banff Centre. And so it's something that I do, and I still freelance and produce, and I help other companies and other people produce podcasts around the city and beyond. And I teach it as well and work with students to produce it.
Awesome. Thanks, Meg. Jeff, I'll get you to introduce yourself next.
Hey, I'm Jeff Evans-Todd. I am an actor and voice actor. I moved out to Vancouver in 2011 from Saskatchewan, and I've been in various TV shows and cartoons and stuff. And when I'm not acting, I teach acting at Vancouver Acting School.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And people might be wondering, why do we have an actor here? He doesn't have a podcast. However, voice acting work is very complex and definitely lends itself to podcasting. So I'm really excited for his input on this panel. Dakota, I'll get you to go next.
Hi, everybody. My name's Dakota. I'm a local social media marketing consultant in Calgary, Alberta. I own my own digital marketing consultancy called Social Centric Inc. And before I opened Social Centric and decided to brave the interweb full time, I dabbled in and was formerly a public relations consultant who worked in both nonprofit and agency. And alongside Alyssa Berry, I operate the podcast Ladies Who Launch, which is a podcast for women, run by women, and dabbles in being opinionated as well as discussing business topics as well as other cool things. So yeah.
Awesome. And I'll hand it over to your counterpart, Alyssa.
Good morning. My name is Alyssa Berry, and I am a marketing communications consultant here in Calgary. And I've been on my own for about 5 years. And as Dakota said, we host Ladies Who Launch, which launched, funny, in March of this year. And it's all about our experiences being women entrepreneurs and giving tips on to women on becoming entrepreneurs and the sort of struggles and successes of being entrepreneurs, as well as we delve into interesting things like our dating lives and being single in Calgary.
Awesome. Looking forward to having you guys on here. Next, I will go over to Matthew.
Hey, yeah, Matthew Cause here. I am a radio host for TSN 1050 in Toronto. A couple years ago, I started a podcast with my old radio partner who had left the station, but we still wanted to continue doing our show, which is a different sort of than your normal sports show. And then my other passion is wine. I got my sommelier degree a couple of years ago, so I decided I wanted to start a wine podcast that was a little more fun and inclusive and to try to make wine less intimidating. So I started that a couple of years ago. So I'm basically Peter Pan combining my love of sports and wine into podcasts.
Oh, that's awesome. And last but not least, Julia from the library.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Audiovisual Support at Riddell Library. So my main role is to oversee the audio rooms that we have, which will be mainly supporting podcasting because we have a lot of students and faculty and staff that are interested in that or have that as one of their assignments. My background is in communications. I did a video production practicum at the Banff Centre. So my interest is like DIY filmmaking, documentary, and I'm really interested in helping people get comfortable with gear. I really believe in that anyone can make their own media, and that includes podcasts. So I'm really interested to delve more into that in my role.
Fantastic. And Julia is going to be offering a couple workshops starting in the fall, so we'll talk about those at the end. But now let's launch into all the fun stuff about getting started with podcasting, because that's why you guys are here. So first, I want us to talk about how do you come up with a podcast concept? And I'm going to get Meg to start this one off for us.
I think when it comes to podcasting, the first thing you have to think about, and actually Matthew's a great example of this, is what are your passions? No one's going to waste their time listening to someone who sounds bored about what they're talking about. If you feel like it's something you have to do, then people aren't going to want to listen. So you want to think about what you really care about and what you want to share. And it helps if you're knowledgeable, but there's a lot of great podcasts out there of people learning about things they're passionate about. And that can be really compelling too. I wonder if I can share a screen, because I do have a document that I'm going to share with you guys after the presentation. Let's see here. A window. And I can share. This is a podcast canvas, and this was designed by Karen Unland at the Podcast Network. Can you guys see this?
Yes, it's up.
Awesome, thank you. I'll zoom in a little bit here. So what's kind of cool about this is if you're trying out an idea and you want to see if it might work, this is a good way to just sort of, ask you some guided questions to get you started on it. So the first thing that you will see is the shared passion, right? List topics you and hopefully your audience love. You might want to think a bit about who are your listeners? Who do you want to listen to this and engage with it? You can think a bit about why yours, what's going to make yours unique. It doesn't have to be the only one of its type, but you have to be offering something a little different, right? And then from there, you can start thinking about the format, right? Do you want it to be interviews? Do you want it to be stories? How often might you want it to happen? Channels, how you might promote it. You don't need to have all of these answers right away, but I find that it's a great way to see if an idea has legs, because realistically, maybe it's an idea that's really great for like 3 episodes, but not a long-term show, right? Or maybe it's something that you see has so many options, it could actually break off into 2 shows. Or maybe it's something you want to start with and then develop into something else. So when I work with clients, I have them fill this out before we meet, just because I find it's a good way to get some ideas on paper and talk a little bit about what you want to accomplish. You'll notice at the bottom, after asking all these questions, we talk about technical needs. And that's because there's so much tech out there, but the truth is 95% of it's probably not applicable to you. I know we're going to get to tech later, but then it can help you decide what gear you need to realize the vision that you have. And I'll leave it at that, because I think this is something that I just wanted to mention, because we're going to talk about a lot of these points throughout the presentation. And I'm sure that many of the other presenters will jump on it too, but this is going to be sent to you. And as you'll see, there's a bit of a free guide there to fill it out. And this is through the Alberta Podcast Network. So I didn't create this, but they're also a really great resource if you're interested in podcasting in Calgary or in Alberta, the whole province, DOI. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Matthew, let's have you weigh in next.
Sorry, but that always takes a second to get the mute off. I think for me, when it comes to starting the podcast and trying to figure out who your audience is, really for me, with the wine one, what I was looking for, what I noticed is that people get really nervous at the LCBO, which is the big wine and alcohol store here in Ontario, and they would get nervous, they get intimidated. And then the same thing at a restaurant when they would fumble with it, or you get that giant, wine list and it looks like Gandalf's spell book. And, I would find that it would make people nervous. And I always thought, wait a minute, wine is supposed to be fun. So I wanted to try to bring that into it. And also I was like bringing a storytelling aspect. So all my guests, it's about wine, but it's more about their journey and, how they got into wine. Why are they passionate about it? What wines do they love drinking? And what I really want to do is sort of demystify it. So, that's sort of where I try to do my passion, but I try to make it different because my personality, I don't like it when things get too snooty or conservative. So I want to sort of push it away from that. And then as for the sports one, that sort of came from, I did a show for several years with a good friend of mine. And even though we're big into sports, our backgrounds are more in the arts. Like we have BAs and, I have a theater background. And so when we did sports, we would also throw in a lot of movie or food or just a lot of sort of pop culture stuff. And so I'm like, okay, let's find a way to combine the two so it's good enough for the hardcore fan, but also someone that just dips their toes. They like sports, but they want to get into their sport and other stuff. So in both podcasts, it's sort of a combination of my passion and also a way to sort of open the net a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. And it's nice to see that these themes are reiterating. Passion is a big thing here. Julia, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think going with whatever sparks your interest or whatever you want to see in the world, and you could be focusing on what you're interested in and what you know about your research, your areas of interest, or you could be kind of taking a more investigative approach. I find that really interesting as well. So I guess it could be either or. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, learning is definitely one of the things we like to do, right? Dakota.
So I think definitely speaking to everybody else, for sure you want to pick something that you're passionate about, but at the same time, much like starting a business, I think you also want to make sure you're filling a gap so that people will be intrigued and subscribing and listening. So just kind of looking at what else is out there, doing a bit of a, like, not to be a communications nerd, but let's face it, most of us are here. A bit of a SWOT analysis of your environment, as well as a bit of a competitive analysis to see what's out there to ensure that your podcast is intriguing.
Yeah, Alyssa, do you have anything to add to that?
Not particularly, but I would say in sort of jumping off from the filling a gap perspective, there's a bazillion podcasts out there, and I think everybody feels that, oh, I can't get into this market because it's so saturated, but everybody is from somewhere. So the more you can dial in on what exactly it is and who you're talking to, the better it is. So for example, you can be hyper local. Like if your podcast is specifically geographic and you want to do a podcast all about like cool things to do in Calgary or all those sorts of things, people will find it. So you don't have to feel that you're competing against like the Tim Ferrisses of the world or the Birds Papaya podcast or any of these sort of massive, large podcasts. You can really dial in on exactly what you want to talk about and who you're talking to. And that can be either specifically geographically targeted or specifically audience targeted. And everybody can fill a space in the podcast landscape. So don't feel that you can't get into it because there's just so many.
Oh, that's so encouraging to hear. Good. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next question. We're going to chat about some different formats of podcasts and kind of the pros and cons of each. Julia, do you want to start us off here?
Sure. Yeah, I really think it depends how comfortable you are being the focus. So there's a monologue kind of style where you're the main speaker and you're going to do the majority of the talking or maybe all the talking. And then there's kind of the interview approach where it's kind of like a one-on-one. And then you might even add additional speakers. Maybe it's a roundtable. Maybe it's a group of you who feel really comfortable bouncing off each other. But really, you have to think about how comfortable you are speaking, but also how comfortable you are with setting up the levels, setting up the microphones, having the right technology in order to have multiple speakers. So the more speakers you have, the more complex that's going to get, but by no means would that be unachievable for someone that's just starting off. But those are a few things to think about.
Awesome. Meg, what are your thoughts here?
I mean, Julia's covered a bunch of it. It's interesting because monologue podcasts were really popular when podcasting was starting. I mean, it's been around for a while, but it was really sort of getting a push around 2004, 2006. That's sort of how people were doing it. They were doing the monologues. We get a little bit of that now. Now some shows will start with a monologue and then maybe move into an interview or something like that. I think of Mark Maron, right? He monologues for a really long time before he gets to his interview. I think the other option that just wasn't mentioned is we have documentary or story, right? Now, normally this is something that most people aren't producing because it takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, and some extra skills development. It doesn't mean it isn't doable, but to plan for that is definitely a lot trickier. So what we tend to see is most podcasts are interviews. They're either interviews or the GabFest, the panel, the chatting, because it is, from a technical standpoint, one of the easiest ones to start with, as you are, as Julia pointed out, figuring out your gear, figuring out your personality on air, finding out who you want to talk to, and doing those things too. But I will point out, sort of going to the idea of, for example, the SWOT analysis or how to make your podcast different. If you're able to come up with an idea that involves recording in the field and takes you out of the studio, that's immediately going to make your podcast a little different than a lot of the ones that are getting started right now.
Great, thank you. Alyssa, I'll go to you next.
I would say the best way to sort of determine how you want your podcast to run or be presented is how you are as a person. So don't try to be different on your podcast than you are personally. So if you are much more of a sort of an introverted person and you want to have more sort of in-depth conversations, or you want your podcast to be you talking about specific topics, then go that route. But if you're more of an outgoing person and you want to showcase that through your podcast and have interviews and talk to people and have a co-host like we do, because that's just how we are in terms of talking to each other about topics, that's what I would look at first is don't try to be a different person on your podcast, because the whole purpose of a podcast is to be a more intimate conversation with your audience. So if your audience doesn't feel that you're being authentic and you're trying to be a podcaster, it immediately turns people off. So just focus on how you would normally talk and how you normally are as a person, and have that reflected in your podcast style.
Yeah, that's great. And that's what makes people relatable and makes people really love certain podcasts, right? As they connect with that host. Dakota, do you have anything to add there?
I mean, Alyssa pretty much said it all, but I would say for our cast in particular, we are conversational in nature. But if you're like an extreme introvert, like a solo cast is even cool. Or let's say you're a storyteller. I listened to this cast called The History Chicks, and it's actually fantastic. It's two gals chatting about amazing women throughout history. And they do a really killer job of just doing a lot of research and really educating you on these people. So yeah, really what you're interested in, filling a gap, and then, being yourself, really. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Let's now talk about time commitment. So this has to do with things like prep time, recording, editing, frequency of production, etc. I don't pretend to know what goes into this, but you guys do. Matthew, do you want to talk about it first?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say the one thing about doing the solo pod, you've got to do the research. Filling time, 5 minutes seems like nothing, but it goes really slow if you don't have all the research there. In terms of time commitment, for myself, if I'm interviewing someone, I'm going to probably spend 3 to 5 hours minimum researching the guest, because my goal is to ask that guest at least one question they've never been asked before. So it's sort of almost like a competition within myself, that at the end I want to stump them and just ask them something they've never been asked, because I find I get the best answers. As for the tech side, if I do especially now that it's not in person, if it's Zoom or Skype, however you do it, it will take me almost as long to edit it as it does to record it, because I got to go through and get rid of all those little time gaps where there's those little lags, and we're going to have even in this conversation. So you got to get rid of all of that, and and then do the work the volume, get the volume up here, because sometimes people speak low. So it takes me like a 45-minute podcast will take me about an hour of post-production before I can release it. And then it's coming up with all the tags and tweets and Instagrams to promote it as well.
Yeah, and that's a great point. It's not just the pod itself, it's everything that goes with the pod in terms of promoting it and things like that. Meg, what are your thoughts here?
Well, playing off of what Matthew's saying, and what you just mentioned, the idea of producing the podcast itself, the editing time and the amount of time you put into it varies depending on your format. It also depends on, for example, if you're just looking to clean up an interview, I would say, yeah, like an hour for 45 minutes makes sense. If you're actually looking to maybe cut that down, maybe you don't want your episodes to be longer than 30 minutes, I would double or almost triple that time if you're going through content and trying to decide what you actually want to keep and what you want to go. If you are maybe taking a few interviews and you're turning it into like a documentary or story focused one, double whatever time you think it is and add 6 hours, because there's probably going to be a problem somewhere in it. And if you come under that time, great, you're going to feel really awesome. But when you're starting to layer in and do those things, it definitely becomes trickier. The other thing is, it's funny, my students, they finish their first podcast and they're like, we're done. And then I was like, no, we need your episode description. No, we need your graphics. No, start thinking about hashtags. So I would say that it's also fair to say that the podcast is probably only the first half of what you're actually producing. The other stuff takes just as long, I would say. Once you start establishing, like you get all your stuff ready through Apple Podcasts and Google and stuff, that gets a little bit faster and you get better on the tech side, and that'll go faster each time. But when you're starting, that's definitely, I'd say, one of the big things, the hills you need to climb.
Yeah, that's a great point. Julia, do you have anything to add here?
I guess I would just add that initially you might need to factor in some time to just get comfortable with the equipment. You really want to invest some time to figure out, if you're using like one of these interfaces, figure out all the menu, figure out how you adjust the levels, just getting really comfortable with it and testing it out. Just recording whatever you want and seeing how that goes. I would invest some time in that.
Well, and that's where people like you come in, who are great to help us resource, right? Oh, she froze on me. Okay, we're going to jump to our next question, and this kind of leads into it. So we're going to talk about what type of equipment is actually required, and can this be done on a budget? Jeff, I'm going to get you to start this one off.
Okay, so yeah, as an actor, I don't have my own podcast yet, but I do have my own recording studio at home here in my storage closet, which is the perfect space to do this in. Yeah, so I really had to think about what sorts of materials I needed to create a sort of an acoustically sound environment. That is first and foremost, to me, probably the most important thing. If I want good quality audio, I need a good quality sound space. So lots of people, when they're starting out doing voiceover, they will sort of put a microphone in their closet, and they'll have a bunch of like blankets or clothes hanging up or something, and that sort of deadens the noise. And we're not recording music or singing vocals or anything. There's not going to be a lot of reverb here that we need. We need a sort of like a deadened sound. Yeah, so the space, I think, is probably the most important thing. But obviously, you're also going to need a microphone, right? And there's kind of two basic kinds of microphones to think about. There's an XLR microphone, and there's a USB microphone. And that refers to the means by which the microphone sort of connects to your software, to your computer. So an XLR microphone, it has to go through an audio interface, sort of an external audio box before it goes into your computer. Whereas a USB microphone has the interface within the microphone, which will save you money on equipment. And there's some really good USB microphones out there these days. But it means that all that processing power has to happen in a smaller space inside that microphone. So it means that sometimes you do lose a little bit of audio quality. So something to think about. But I'll leave it at that. Let everyone else sort of touch a little bit more on it.
All right, fantastic. So sound space, microphones. Julia, what do you have to add to this?
Yeah, if you are using a USB microphone to connect to your computer, you need software on your computer to record with, unless you're going to be recording a conversation on Skype or on Google Meets, for example, then you can use that recording. But Audacity is a great software that's free. It's available on Mac and it's available on Windows, so anyone can use it. It's not super great for recording multiple microphones at once, but usually with a USB microphone plugged into your computer, you're just going to be recording yourself anyway. So I don't know if it would be useful for me to put the link in the chat for that software. Okay. So I can do that. So it's free, so that's great.
Yeah, and that's actually what one of your workshops is going to focus on, is using Audacity, right? Great. Meg.
Yeah, I mean, a lot's been covered already. I think part of it is figuring out what you want your show to be, or what kind of recording you want to do. If you're doing an interview-focused show, it's totally fine to have a USB mic that you plug in. Maybe you're interviewing people like via Skype, or you're using, I'm thinking like Squadcast or any of those other types of software that you can use as well. my background as a journalist is that I started with a handheld mic and a mobile recorder, a personal recorder. And what I love about that is it means that I can go out into the field. If I want to record birds in a park and I want to layer that under, I can. If I want to go interview someone in the park where there's sounds happening around us, I can do that, and then I take the audio and I edit it at home. And at the same time, if I wanted to, I could literally go climb into a closet and record my voice to do a voiceover for something with a handheld microphone too. For many people, it isn't necessarily something they need to consider, but I do want to point out that everyone thinks they need to have an at-home recording studio, and you don't necessarily need to. If you have a handheld mic, you have a simple, recorder like a Marantz or a Zoom or whatnot, you can actually go out, record in the field, do all sorts of really cool stuff, and still record stuff at home if you're doing voiceovers or things like that as well, depending on the quality of the mic and what you have set up. So there are different options for you if you want to have flexibility in how you're recording. So I started with one of those kits, the handheld mic and the recorder. I go and do most of my interviews with that if I'm out in the field and talking to people in other places. And then when I'm doing my show with CKUA here at home, I literally have, as you can see right there, a USB mic, and it's on a stand. And I go and I set it up in front of my closet because clothes are really good for baffling and helping with sound. And I try to put the cats in the other room so they don't bother me. And I just record my radio show in my closet, literally. So it kind of depends on what you're looking to do with your gear. And I should say that USB mics, if you're starting out, you don't need a really expensive one. Under $150 will get you something that'll be a good start, and then you can always grow and go from there too. You don't need to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on your gear. When you start, when you become a gear nerd, you might.
Awesome. And I've heard some of your clips on CKUA and they sound just great. No cats in the background or anything. Okay, we're going to flip to the next question just because I'm mindful of time here. We're going to talk about who you should be targeting for your audience, and is this really even important? Matthew, we're going to start with you here.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, quick shout out to Audacity. I have a BlackBerry. I'm a dummy, and Audacity is super simple. Even I can use it. Yeah, I mean, that is always the debate because you want to cast the widest net. But sometimes if you're just trying to go from everyone, then I think, you lose your focus. I think you have to be comfortable knowing your podcast is probably not going to be for everyone. And I think it is important to try to know who your audience is, because if you're mindful of it, that'll help your quality of the podcast because you always have an idea of who you are speaking to. Like, for instance, I know that, my podcasts are for people that love either sports or wine, but they don't necessarily have to be the most hardcore ones. In fact, really hardcore wine people or hardcore sports people, they might actually be a little bit turned off by what I do, but I'm very comfortable with that because one lesson or a couple lessons is, one, don't take it personal if someone doesn't like your pod, and two, know that you're never going to get 100% approval rating. Find that lane, and those people will love it. And if they love it, they'll be your best promo people. They'll tell others and they'll bring them in.
Yeah, that word of mouth marketing is great for podcasts. Dakota, we're going to flip to you. Coming from the marketing world, obviously, audience is important in what you do in your work. How does it connect to your podcast?
So going back to kind of the initial planning that you should be doing anytime you try to put something out there into the world, you should really be doing ample research into who's going to be interested in your product that you're offering, which is your podcast, and kind of what age group just doing your research, like what age group is most interested in these kinds of topics. For Alyssa and I, obviously, it's female entrepreneurs mostly that we target. We definitely work with males as well, but obviously our main focus is females. And it's not just in the entrepreneur space either. It's moms, it's just women in general, it's individuals who identify as women, things like that. So just really doing your reconnaissance into who is going to be interested in that gap that you're trying to fill and that topic that you're talking about, and then targeting them in a way that you're, amplifying that audience in all of your digital marketing, making sure you have a plan for guests where they have to repost the cast or talk about the fact that they're going to be on the cast. Maybe push it out a few more times after it's come out. Maybe taking footage as you're taping to drum up some buzz and interest in the cast that might be coming up. So just really doing lots of different research, and then also making sure that you're actively working with your guests and the people that you're trying to target to create sort of a fandom, if you will, to get your cast noticed a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. And I noticed that you and Alyssa both put things up on LinkedIn as part of your push for your podcast, which is great. Alyssa, do you have anything to add to this?
Good grief, it's hard to unmute on this system. I don't have anything really more to add. I think what I will more touch on is the next question in terms of how you promote your podcast. And I think we can sort of launch into that probably from what Dakota talked about.
Yeah, actually, if you want to go ahead with that right now, we can do that.
Yeah, so sort of launching off what Dakota said, having a promotional plan for your podcast is important. And I think it was Meg or Julia before that had commented that like recording your podcast is really only like a portion of what you have to do. Once it's recorded, there's a whole other process that has to take place. And in terms of time and resources, being able to promote your podcast and what that looks like is a big component of that. So, I mean, obviously Dakota and I are marketers, so we took a little probably more interesting take on promoting it. But if you can't get people to listen to it, or you're not going to tell people where it is and how to listen to it and how they can subscribe and what your topic is about, then you're sort of just talking into the ether of the internet. So ensuring that you have a really strong strategy of how you're pushing it out, whether it's on social, whether it's through your professional networks, posting it on your LinkedIn, all those pieces that connect. Like it's basically you're creating a marketing plan for a product. So what does that look like? And how would you do that if you were launching a winery, like to sort of go with Matthew's topic. And the second thing is, and Dakota touched on it a little bit, is your guests have to have a responsibility. So if you are having guests on your podcasts, we have are creating a bit of an onboarding process where if you're a guest on our podcast, these are your responsibilities. That means telling your network you're going to be on the podcast, and like announcing it when it goes live. Here's some templates that you can push out on your networks in terms of what the podcast is about. Talk about it. Like there is a reciprocal relationship, and that it's not just about us. It's like if you're having a guest on your podcast, they also have a responsibility in helping promote the show and their episode and what that looks like. So creating good processes around onboarding your guests and what guests you have on your show will really go a long way in helping to push that out to the larger internet world.
Yeah, that's a great point. Cross promotion is so important with podcasts. I know so many people that I follow on social media that host podcasts are often like highlighting we have guests, and then all of a sudden that guest will appear as somebody as I should follow, and it's that back-to-back reciprocal relationship. Absolutely. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. We are going to chat about what are some ways to engage the listeners. Meg, I'm going to get you to start this one off for us.
I think one of the first things when you're thinking about engaging a listener is you want to think about the medium of podcasting itself. Podcasting, like the only word you can use is intimate. And it's an awkward word to say with all these people I've just met, but it's true, right? If I'm listening on my phone and I have my earbuds on, your voice is literally in my ear. So you want to think about, even if a room of people are listening together, they're engaging with it individually. And that means that when you're writing, you're talking, you want to talk about me and you. Or I guess if two hosts, it could be us and you. You want to make it very direct, and you want to communicate that way. And then if we look at other radio rules, depending on other experts, they would say you 5 times for every time you say me. Though on podcasting, I think you could be a little flexible with that. You want to think about how you're talking directly to that person and how you're communicating on an individual level. That's going to make people want to stay in. You want to think a bit about your structure too. You want to make sure that what you're doing makes sense to someone who might be new to it, right? Generally, you can organize things by topics and by chronology. So if you're organizing an interview, for example, you're going to want to start with more basic establishing questions about maybe earlier on in their career or where they're at, and then moving on to things that are a bit more recent so that the person who might never have met this guest before can actually follow along with you and can understand what's going on. They can sort of engage and understand in real time. But I'll hand it over to someone else to share a bit on engagement too, because there's so many different ways you can engage an audience.
Yeah, Matthew, we'll go to you next.
On my the Mako and Cause one, more the sports and pop culture food kind of one. Like we always do, listener questions is sort of a really just simple standard one, but like we use that, and so we get people to tweet in on either our podcast Twitter account or on our individual ones, and also by doing that, then now we're tweeting back and forth with everybody, and so then that's sort of another way to sort of just gain some more momentum with listenership. And then also I always try to think of the idea of ownership, and I want the audience to know who I am, or who Bob and I, who we are. And I find that level of ownership also means that people will keep listening, because once they get a better sense of idea of who you are, it's amazing how that will hook people on. I mean, there's podcasts I listen to, I feel I know more about them and their kids than I do about my own brother and his kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are some podcast hosts that share very, very intimate details of their life. Girls Gotta Eat is one of them. Jeff, we're going to go to you next.
Okay, so I think there's a couple big things that I find really engage me as a listener. I think one of them is emotion. It is passion. It is understanding how you really feel about what you're talking about. Taking some time to actually sit with those feelings and understand why you have them. I mean that's obviously something that I teach to my acting students is, what are you actually saying? Why are you saying it? Why is it important to you? And then another big thing is understanding relationship. When you're thinking about your audience, I mean, it might be a bit more applicable to like a monologue style podcast as opposed to an interview dialogue sort of podcast. But, if you're doing this monologue podcast, you've got your big wide net of an audience out there. And you're not actually speaking to a real person when you're recording that podcast. You got to think about like who's listening and who in my life is comparable to who I'm speaking to. It's much easier to think about a specific person in the booth with you or on the other side of the microphone from you than it is to try to speak to a broad audience of people. So for me, specificity is super important, and that once you start speaking to someone specific, it sounds more intimate. It sounds more authentic. If you know who you're talking to, how you feel about that person, that intimacy is going to come across.
Yeah, and that's an acting trick too. If you're ever on camera and the person you're speaking to, you want to be very specific about that. Maybe this is a good way to actually roll into the next question, and how voice work can take a podcast to the next level. Jeff, we'll start with you just because, I mean, that is really your specialty here. Sure,
yeah. Voice work, I mean, I can talk about voice work all day long. So I'll try to keep it simple. I think that for one thing, like a big part of acting and of voice work is breathing, right? I know that sometimes I get anxious and I start speeding through what I'm saying. And if I can just take a pause, take a deep breath, and connect to my body, connect to how I'm feeling, I can slow things down, and I engage with, your emotions actually are really connected to your breath. I don't think a lot of people know this, but we restrict our breath a lot. A lot of people, when you ask them to take a deep breath, watch them. They'll breathe up into their shoulders, up into their chests. You've got all this breath space below that. So start thinking about breathing into your bellies, and that will connect you to the present moment more, make you more connected to whoever it is you're speaking to in that podcast, and then bring in that intimacy. Additionally, I think it'd be really valuable to look at like a vocal warm-up, maybe do a YouTube search for a vocal warm-up. It's going to give you things like tongue twisters and vocal scales and things to go through, breathing exercises. And even just doing a simple like tongue twister before you go into any public speaking or audio recording type of scenario is going to help you. It's going to help your facial muscles just wrap around words a lot more easily. Because again, speaking from my own personal experience, when I do get worked up and excited, I get a little anxious and I start to just rip through words and I lose consonants. I lose some of those syllables in there. So it's valuable to just slow things down and learn to articulate. And that's going to bleed through into that podcast that you're recording if you just take the time beforehand to do something like that. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And Meg, your thoughts?
That's all really great advice, especially if you pause and you take a breath. That's going to help you on your editing. If you start doing your next sentence right after, you have words blurring in, it's going to be a pain to edit it. So taking that pause is really, really great. Other, I guess, advice I would give from a voicing perspective, especially if you're voicing on your own and you're recording something, I personally prefer standing up. I know we always see images of people sitting down and voicing, but then you hunch over, it's hard to get good breath. You really need to get a bit more energy out when you're talking into a microphone. And so standing can help you give that as well. The first radio show I ever did for CBC, I had to voice ahead of time and on my own. And the idea of talking to someone, as Jeff was mentioning, so essential, but really difficult. So what I ended up doing was my mentor, Julie Nazrella, who hosts Tempo on Radio 2, or I guess now CBC Music, she gave me one of her photos, her opera photos, and she's looking like this in it, like she's just leaning in, like I'm saying the most interesting thing in the world. And when I go to this booth by myself where I'd stand up, I'd literally pin that photo and just talk to Julie. And it's amazing when you imagine a person, or if you have a person to talk to as you voice, if you have that option, it really changes how you engage compared to just performing a script rather and being able to talk to someone. Another thing that I find really helpful is if you're getting kind of nervous and in your head, physically start smiling. If you want to say something that's warm and welcoming and you want to sound kind of relaxed, smile. It changes the tone of what you're saying immediately. It forces you to slow down because it's hard to talk while smiling. And also you're doing radio or podcasting, so no one's going to see that you're smiling to no one. But it's a helpful trick when you're starting to figure out and sort of get that warmth and richness.
Awesome. So I'm just looking at time. We have about 16 minutes left. We don't have any questions in the chat box right now, so I'm going to keep going with questions, but we might do this as a little bit more of sort of a speed round. So if everyone can just give like one highlight point, I think that would be great. Let's talk about guests on podcasts and what to really consider and keep in mind. Matthew, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think when it comes to guests, obviously you want someone dynamic, someone who is going to give to you. But really what I look for the most is who are the best storytellers? Give me the guests who've got the most interesting stories, and I want to get that out to the listener.
Awesome. Alyssa?
I would completely agree. It's all about telling a good story. So when you're finding guests, find guests that that you're interested in, because if you're interested in them, then your audience is interested in them. And also find guests that they don't have to be public speaking experts or have been on a podcast before, but they have to know how to tell a story. Because there's nothing worse than having guests on a podcast that have one-word answers or they go off on tangents. So just be cognizant of where your guest maybe has appeared and take a look at some of their online content to ensure that they're the type of style of guest that you want on your show.
Yeah, definitely. Julia?
Yeah, I guess I would just reiterate what kind of has already been said, but yeah, just thoroughly researching who you're inviting on. Consider, do you want someone who's an expert? Do you want to just have more of a like casual chat? Like how in depth do you want their knowledge to be, I guess? And where do you want the conversation to go?
Yeah, and I guess it depends if you're coming at it from an investigative point of view or if you are the expert and just kind of inviting someone in to help strengthen your platform, right? Dakota.
I would really just echo what Alyssa kind of mentioned. But I would also say, it's all about building a community as well. So while I would never recommend, like only choosing people who have a really ample following, obviously we want to support others and highlight the people that are going to intrigue our guests. I think supporting people while also just making sure, again, that they're supporting you and just giving back and forth to each other in terms of engagement and sharing and things like that.
Great, and we're going to wrap up this question with Meg, and then we'll go into Q&A because I have seen the chat box being flooded with questions.
I think everyone's covered almost everything. Alyssa was talking about someone who's game and good as a guest. The term we use in radio is a good talker. You want someone who's going to be energetic and want to be there and be part of it. The one thing I will say is as you get your podcast started, a lot of people will probably recommend themselves as guests or maybe recommend other people. You don't have to take all of those, but feel free to do a bit of background, maybe talk, or pre-interviews are a great way to test out if someone might be a good guest or not and whether you'd want to have them on your show.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to go to Q&A right now. Taylor asked the first question, but I think we actually just covered it with this question because it says, for those with existing podcasts, do you have certain criteria you use to pick guests to bring on? So I think you guys have really just covered that here. We are going to go to the next question, which is down a little ways. Kaylin, I think that's how you pronounce your name, wants to know your guys' favorite publishing platform and why. Meg, since you're up on my screen, we'll go with you.
Sorry, it wasn't unmuting. For publishing, lately I've been using Simplecast a lot. Funnily enough, I think it was just sold to SiriusXM. I love it because it is its name. It has a really easy background and it's unlimited bandwidth. You don't have to worry about getting a special account where it's like certain amounts of downloads or certain amounts of episodes a month. So it keeps it pretty straightforward.
Alyssa, I see you nodding. Do you use that one as well?
Yes, we use Simplecast as well.
Awesome. Matthew, what do you use?
I use Audio Boom. I pay a small amount per month, but again, what I like about it is it's super easy. And what I love about Audio Boom is I can get it so that all my podcasts will go to Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, Apple. It'll go to all of them really easily. And since I'm the one who has to do all the producing and the tech, and again, I'm not smart, it helps me do it quickly.
Great. I mean, I'm sure you're smart. You might just not be tech smart. Julia, you are tech smart.
Hello. Yes, I guess I don't know as much from the marketing perspective, but I know like for most people are familiar with SoundCloud. And for they might already know that website, and you can get the RSS feed from SoundCloud and use that feed to distribute it to other platforms like Spotify. So that's one that people might already be familiar with. That might be a little bit easier.
Great. Okay, next question. Ian, Meg, you mentioned teaching that you teach a podcast class. Can those that are in non-journalism programs still take this course?
Unfortunately, not right now, unless you're in the journalism program, you can't. However, lately it's been about like annually, I've been doing a set of 3 podcasting workshops with the Calgary Public Library. So if you keep an eye out, those are free and we'll probably be doing them by Zoom this time. I've also started we kind of like a book club for podcasts. It's called Pod Chats. And actually our first session is tonight. I think there's still spots and we're going to have a different guest speaker every month talking. You get sort of an assigned listening and then we end up talking about that. So there's some programming through the public library, and also I would check out the Alberta Podcast Network if you're looking for some workshop opportunities as well.
Wonderful. And as I did mention, Julia is going to be offering some classes regarding podcasting and audio stuff. Julia, do you just want to talk about that real quick here?
Yeah, sure. So there's 2 different workshops that I've developed. One is for introducing just basic podcasting formats and how to go about starting, but with a particular focus on academic podcasting. So a particular focus for those that want to share their research through podcasting. Maybe they get podcasting assignments or they have some other related interests. So there's that workshop. That's on September 15th. And then there's another workshop that will just introduce you to Audacity as a software, how to record and how to edit. So that will just give you a broad overview of how to use that for a podcasting project. I can share both of those links. And that second workshop, that's on the 22nd of September.
Yeah, and if you guys can't attend in September, these will be happening in October, November, and December as well. Chelsea's got a couple questions on here. She wants to know, when do you need to consider advertising and how does this work? Dakota, maybe I'll flip this to you.
Awesome. So I would say that you probably want to spend about like minimum 3 months getting your podcast off the ground. So like a good general rule of thumb for any sort of digital marketing is you want to have at least 3 months worth of content there. So people actually have something to listen to, look at, so on and so forth. And then at that point, I'd recommend starting off with like a bit of a boosted posts budget. So if you're promoting your podcast on Instagram and Facebook, maybe you just want to add, like $15 to $25, just quick little, infusion of cash to get that post a little bit further. Depending on where you're advertising to, you could look at doing Twitter campaigns, which are actually quite inexpensive. And then, yeah, I would recommend coming up with a full bore advertising strategy and figuring out what your budget is for the year, depending on where you want to get with your podcast. I'd recommend anywhere, and again, this is pretty in-depth stuff, but I recommend a ballpark of $500 to $1,000 over the year to try and get your cast off the ground, depending on who you're trying to target and which channels.
Great. And you and Matthew both mentioned like the importance of word of mouth marketing as well, like getting your word out with your followers and that. Chelsea asked another question about recording podcasts in advance, but I think you just covered that there, saying, have your 3 months ready to go. And then you can always build up as you move forward. I think it also depends too, if you want to have your podcast recurring like weekly or monthly or daily or whatever it is. Like some people post more frequently than others, right? Michelle wants to know how many guests on a panel are too many on a podcast, I'm guessing. Meg, do you want to answer this?
It really depends on your comfort, but I will say that I would start with 2 and probably never go past 3, because not only are you the person, or do you have to consider getting enough time for everyone, but you have to figure out how you're going to manage those 2 or 3 people. So I'd say start with 2, see how you feel about it. Maybe add a 3rd person. You might also want to think a bit as you devise your panel how you can be diverse, not only in opinion, but also in voice, because sometimes the challenge when you're recording a panel is if you have 3 people that sound the exact same, then you're going to have to spend a lot of time identifying who's who and how that's going on too. So just things to consider. But like 4, 5, 6, oh man, like don't set yourself up for the heartache.
I see Matthew shaking his head there.
Yes, absolutely. The total clutter, keep it small, more intimate, allows people to really get their opinions out.
Great. We have one. Oh, no, we have more than one question. Kate, how do we collect stats on number of listeners? Are there any of you who are doing that right now? Matthew, Kate, go ahead.
I'll just say real quick, it's one good thing about Audio Boom. They do have a lot of different analytics tools that can give you your numbers and can break it down also geographically. So I use them.
You can do that in Simplecast as well. It tells you how many downloads you had per episode and where those downloads came from, and it'll tell you how many new downloads you had per episode. So most of the platforms will actually have analytics attached within them that you can utilize to evaluate the success of your podcast.
Fantastic. Okay, Kendra wants to know, how much information do you give guests before you have them on? As in, do you give them the questions you're going to ask, or do you ask for their input on it? Does anyone in particular want to take this one?
I'll just say it kind of depends on the guests. Like sometimes the PR people will reach out to me and they'll want to get an idea. So I'll give them sort of my mission statement about what I want to accomplish with the podcast. And the only time I give more information, if I know it's going to be like a tricky question that could take them some time to think about it, just to try to avoid the uhs and oohs, that when they're thinking so long for the answer. But I only want to give a little bit because you still want to be able to surprise and have that naturalness.
Yeah, definitely. Jeff, Melinda was asking for books and links on how-tos. We can get to that at the end, and just everyone will be providing some resources at the end here. that I will send out on email. Jeff would like to know, could you do mixed formats such as interviews and storytelling, or would you recommend sticking to one format? Meg, do you want to take this one?
I think a lot of shows mix formats with a lot of success. It's a good way to keep it interesting and moving. That means you need to be comfortable with those formats. So what I would probably recommend is start with one, see how it goes, and doesn't mean you can't add another segment after or add another element. What your first episode sounds like is hopefully not what your podcast sounds 20 episodes down the line. So feel free to experiment and try and mix formats if it makes sense for you. Sometimes a certain story might make sense to change the format, right? Maybe a lot of things you do can be told in an interview, but then you get this one, like maybe this story, like this history of this weird little park in your neighborhood, and you need to tell it through 3 different perspectives, and you want to try mixing up a little pocket doc or a mini documentary, then it's a great opportunity to try it out. So definitely don't be afraid to mix formats, but I would start with one and then grow for sure.
Wonderful. Natalia would like to know, how do you enlist sponsors or sponsorships for your podcasts? Dakota or Alyssa, do you guys want to take this one?
I think Alyssa has some really good stuff to add to this, but I'll just really quickly say, actually, Alyssa and I hilariously are in this space right now. We're trying to make a plan to figure out how we want to do this. I would say it's really important to get established first. So Alyssa and I have been going now for almost 3 or 4 months, and we've got like pretty good downloads and subscribers. So I'd recommend getting into the thousands with your downloads and subscribers, and even with your followership, just so that you've got something to go on. And then, looking at your guests in a very, organic, friendly way, seeing if maybe they'd be interested, like, oh, you're going to be a guest on the podcast. Did you have anything you wanted to maybe potentially advertise? Would you like to sponsor this episode? And maybe even just starting it off in kind for your guests, just to get it going. And then if they see some kind of return, then maybe they'll spread the word to other sponsors. But I would say once you get into the thousands with your subscriptions and followers and all of that, people will just start to organically approach you. But Alyssa, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that covers it. I do agree that you should be established first, because you have to provide some proof points to any potential sponsor or advertiser. You have to be able to say that you have X amount of downloads, you have X amount of subscribers, we've had this many guests, and this is sort of the topics. Like, because people, if they're going to put their money in, they want to know that they're going to see results. And the second thing, and Dakota sort of alluded to it, is putting together a proper sponsorship or advertising, whatever, pitch deck. So when somebody wants to or inquires about your podcast, you have specific rates, you have specific, so a 15-second spot is this, or a 30-second is this, or if you want us to just voice over an ad, or if you want to sponsor a show, there's specific metrics attached to that in terms of dollar value and what you get as a result of that. So that's what I would do. And then you want to probably start small and approach people that you already know, or approach people that already support your podcast, approach people in your professional networks, or like in our world, we have clients, so it provides us an opportunity to give promotional availability to our clients and what they're working on. So that's how you'd sort of start that ball rolling.
Wonderful. Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I do see there are more questions in the chat box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these questions. I will forward them to all the panelists. If anybody has advice that they can weigh in, we'll be able to send this out with resources. I just want to say thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists who joined us here today, and everybody who attended. I know a lot of people were running to a meeting that starts right at 12 o'clock. So thank you so much for engaging with this. And keep an eye on your inbox. I'll be sending out a feedback survey, as well as the resources and answers to those questions. So thank you so much, you guys. Have a wonderful day. Bye.